In terms of gaps that we need to fill, I think across the US, the narrative on how we talk to people about climate change has shifted over the last few years. And we've really learned from the mistakes of both framing it as a debate and also using the predominant left-wing critical narrative of you should change your life because of X, Y, and Z. And we've learned that that's just simply not effective. And so I think in terms of where we're going and the opportunities are really to speak to people about solutions and learn more about how we can empower them to make positive change in their life and beyond. And I think that the strategic component of that, we're just now beginning to understand the value of it. And there's a lot of research that points toward the value of that's simply the only way that you can really engage Americans on this issue, solutions-based and very positively.
Yeah, I'd second all of that. I think that the biggest suffering point in this has been the polarisation that's happened between left and right. The fact that one went from being a universal issue when it was first started to be talked about in the 80s, kind of shifted to this place where it became a predominantly left-wing narrative. And that means that the people who still need to be engaged with this are people who tend towards the right wing. And there's a lot of new work being done in that space, for example, outreach to evangelical Christian groups, outreach by the Pope to Catholic groups, outreach in the South in places where it's rural, where farmers are being really badly affected by climate change. The great part of those stories is these are people who are already being affected right now, today. For example, if you're a farmer who's going through a drought. And also, just to re-emphasise your point, the more that you can give people to do about this problem by giving them ways that they can be engaged, the less likely they are to forget. Because what we know is that if people aren't given a way that they can take action on something, it becomes really deprioritised in their mind because the brain is programmed to act on things that are easy to act on, that it can very quickly see the solution to. So the more that we can provide those answers to people in the content that we're giving them, the more likely they are to do something.
I'd just add to the developing world. So we're obviously here in the US, but in terms of previous work I've done, say I did a survey of 33,000 people across 7 countries in Asia for the BBC. Now, of those countries, and it was nationally representative in 5 of them, less so state and province level in India and China, what we found is that, a good 40% of people didn't know what climate change was. And this was kind of reflected in the films we watched today. So how do you communicate to, and perhaps as importantly, with these people about these issues? What are they doing already to adapt to the changes in climate they notice? And just to re-emphasize that, it's communicating with audiences as much as to them. It's not just a top-down narrative, here's what's going on in Paris. What about your local issues?
And so, how do some of the projects that you've done, you mentioned, I know the risky business reports and those things, they're meant to engage policymakers. How do you, or to a degree, how do they connect with people? And then, something like Years of Living Dangerously, is there any two-way street? these are big, and really important sort of ways of communicating with people. How were you able to get two-way feedback, or were you?
Sure. For risky business, it's as much a business audience as it is a policymaker audience. We're not policy prescriptive. I think the way in which we get all of these people in the room is to agree on the nature of the risk, to attempt to quantify that risk, and then each of our co-chairs, each of our risk committee members can talk about different elements of solutions which they favour. The way in which we manage to communicate to that business audience is by knowing that audience a little bit better. So communicating to them in terms they understand, and this often meant dollar figures. The way in which we got to them was direct, it's peer-to-peer engagement from a lot of our risk committee members, but it's also through the media. I'm sure we'll touch on this in a moment. It's, there is an appetite for mass media coverage in the financial and business press, and that is perhaps a relatively recent development, but as someone who's lived in the UK for a long time, I still read the FT, and there's been 3 cover stories about climate change, kind of focused on Paris, kind of not, in the last year. Politica Clark and these people doing great work, and they're engaging a slightly different audience in terms they understand.
For sure. So Years of Living Dangerously, rather than targeting a really specific group like the financial community, was all about mass communication to people who have just not engaged with this issue at all, like anyone who It's like an ordinary viewing citizen. And it's kind of like a cheap play. It's like, let's get celebrities and get the celebrities to talk about climate change. Seems really basic, but it kind of works. So it's like that's the starting point to get people in, get them excited, make something that is kind of frightening and intimidating and a bit sciencey and not very sexy, a bit more sexy. So go check it out, because in the very first episode what you see is Harrison Ford getting into a fight with the Indonesian forestry minister over palm oil. So, injecting a bit of like very tangible human drama. Now, in terms of translating that into action, like finding things for the audience who watch that to do, it's actually not that easy, and very few organisations have done this successfully. So what the organisation that I work for has started to try and do is embed the call to action, so the thing the person can do, into the video itself. So even as you're watching it right there, you can click on it on YouTube, sign the petition, without even stopping watching. So the more that, and we do that because we know that within just a few minutes of a person finishing watching a thing, that's when their attention trails off. You've got like a really short window to get them to actually do something. So the more you can make it kind of a bit like American Idol, it's like text in with your favourite contestant while you're still watching the show, then you're going to get a lot better pickup.
So you could text in Harrison Ford.
Text kick butt, or it's like if at the bottom of the screen, for example, you're watching something like what we just watched now, and a little thing comes up that says, text your representative right here by dialing this number, or put in your email address right here. You're going to capture people at the moment of maximum excitement and interest.
And so, beyond, reports and peer-to-peer relationships and TV shows, these are really interesting traditional forms of media and ways to get people engaged. Are there any sort of more innovative things that come to mind when it comes to bringing folks, into the sort of making climate interesting, or, to get them involved?
Art across all different types of its forms is very powerful. So we know from the psychological research that art creates emotional experiences for people where dry, technical, scientific information does not. And people make decisions in their lives based on emotion, based on things, experiences they've had, or ones that they see and experience in a secondary fashion via art. So I think that there's a tremendous amount of work going on across various types of media in the art world on this topic. I've done a lot of work that pairs climate scientists with artists. One that comes to mind that I've worked a lot with is Lars John. He develops these 3-ton human-sized aquariums and puts them in public spaces and has the water level rise and fall to correspond with sea level, and has people performing everyday mundane actions in these tanks as the water level rises and falls. And what may sound kind of dry when you're actually up there experiencing it is tremendously powerful. And so art, in terms of both a vehicle for communication, but also as a way to engage an entirely different set of the population that is trying to grasp and think about these issues, is tremendously powerful.
I would also say, sorry.
No, you
don't give up on TV. As a result of the research we did in Asia, a number of the Bangladeshi filmmakers we were working with in Dhaka then took the results and took, this is results about mass media usage among a target audience in rural Bangladesh, so we're looking at farmers. What TV do they have access to? Well, if you go to the low-lying chors, which are these islands in the middle of the river, and they're temporary, and people only live there for 2 or 3 years at a time. But they have access to a BTV set, which just gives you the state broadcaster and can be run even if you don't have access to the grid. And so, they watch TV, they tend to watch it as a community at a particular time of day, between 6 and 8 p.m. So, let's make a program in a format that they'll watch, that they like, that features people like them at that time of day. And so the resulting TV show, Amrai Pari, is in its 2nd series now. It gets about 11 million viewers. It's on prime time, and it's a reality television show going around different communities in Bangladesh, encouraging adaptation to the changes they notice. Sort of the usual thing: economic empowerment, building floating gardens, doing real, tangible things that benefit that community. But because no one really wants to change, because there's the conflict like Harrison Ford and the Indonesian Ministry for chopping down forests, there's drama there and people watch it. So yeah, don't give up on TV, lots of people watch it.
The other thing that I'd add to that is the great thing about TV and other mainstream media is just regularity. People have to keep on hearing these stories. You need to know that it's going on all the time. So the more that we can just generate more stories about climate change and get them into media that people are already watching in primetime slots, that's a really important piece of this. The other kind of slightly different angle of this is not really media, it's about having individual conversations. Because we also know that the person who's most likely to get you to believe in climate change and start to do something about it is a relative or a friend. So, but we all feel a bit embarrassed about going to that conservative uncle that we have and being like, so, you want to get a Prius or something? It's like a really hard conversation to have. So the more that we can kind of start to build up the guts to remove the taboo around talking about climate change with people in our own lives, the better it gets.
So now you know what to do for Thanksgiving, I guess.
Yeah, that's your homework.
Well, I have some more questions, but I'd rather open up to the audience here. So if you have any questions, raise your hand.
I think it's a really, really good question. And a lot of the solutions in terms of pressuring a business are very similar to pressuring a government. Particularly because, in a way, you have more power because they have systems in place for you to actually go and complain, or go and make requests, or go and say, I have been a loyal customer for the past 30 years, and what I'd like to see you do is X, Y, and Z. So, you can still write letters, go on social media. The great thing about social media is really public. They kind of have to respond to you when you're tweeting at them. There's also the boycotting aspect of it if you want to get in that direction, but a lot of businesses are onto this, as we heard from the last panel. A lot of businesses have got their own internal carbon prices. They are trying to do things. So what you can do is you can praise them for the stuff that they're already trying to do, like groups like H&M, which are trying to recycle clothes, or IKEA, which is rolling out LEDs, and then ask them to take the next step. So it's like carrot and sticks, like I will buy from you if you do this good thing. And then the other capacity where you can make change is as a shareholder. We heard about divestment in the last video a little bit, and that is something that you can investigate if your 401k or anything like that is where it's invested, how it's being used.
I would just add that on the other end of that, on the business end, there's a lot of work going on to understand how you can communicate products better to people. So there's been some research that looks, for example, at how you label different environmentally friendly products. And if they carry a green label, oftentimes conservatives in the United States will not buy them, even if they're a cheaper product. So there's a lot to be said in terms of how you market and how you communicate to people and understand what types of messages you're conveying to them. Green is not necessarily the way. You need to understand, what really beats their drum, and that might be saving money over, being green. It's a great question, and I think there are a number of threads that you can pick up on. I would just say that I do think that the landscape is changing in the United States for Republicans on this issue. I think within the conservative arena, you're starting to see political candidates being increasingly marginalized for this. Their advisors are telling them, hey, you can't not address this issue because it's what your constituents care about. You're seeing Bob Inglis stand up with his group, Republican, Young Conservatives for Energy Reform, the Clear Path Foundation. So more work needs to be done to show why this is actually a conservative issue and how it aligns with conservative values. I think that that's a huge gap right now across both the media and other forms of communication.
One little addition. It may be, you think about message, you think about messenger. And it may be that we are not the best messengers to that audience. I think that, one of the really interesting things about Clear Path, which focuses on this, is it's Republicans talking to Republicans about climate change. So perhaps you or I going to the Midwest isn't the way to go.
For sure, and something that we have tried to do at my current work that we also used on Years of Living Dangerously was evangelical preachers, or farmers, or NASCAR drivers, or people who speak to that audience, who are the right kind of message of it. I know, the NASCAR thing, they've actually committed to going 100% renewable in quite a short space of time, so that's interesting. If they can do it, anyone can. But there's also, I think you use the absolute right phrase, which is making them feel safe to support this. And that's like kind of about something called normative bias, where we assume that people kind of think the same way we do. What a lot of Americans don't know is that 75% of Americans actually believe in climate change. And when you say that to them, they go, oh, well, I believe in climate change too. Because the way the human brain works is it just goes to whatever the mass assumption in the room is. So the more that you can create that atmosphere where it feels like climate change is just like something that the average person does actually care about, the closer you get to having politicians build up will.
And I would just add one more piece to that, which in addition to, 75% of Americans agree that climate change is happening, there's overwhelming political and public support for renewable energy and clean energy, and that's the main entree. You can completely separate climate change from clean energy if you need to and talk about public health, energy independence, national security, and oftentimes more conservative audiences will support those regardless of the climate change issue.
Well, I think that, again, to draw from some previous work from the New Climate Economy, we're going to, across sort of major economies, we're going to spend $90 trillion on infrastructure anyway over the next 15 years, right? So that's an incredible amount of money that's going to be invested in replacing existing infrastructure, building new things. So it's really important to make sure that that infrastructure is compatible with a low-carbon world. And actually, it doesn't cost that much more. And so you ask, how do we speed up change? There's an economic incentive to do so. There's an astonishing economic opportunity associated with reducing climate risk across the developed world and the developing world. So I think this is something that can bring us together, even if, you see in Paris, there will be, the next month you'll see lots of squabbling, lots of the old framing, north versus south. It's not really like that. There's a shared opportunity, and that's great.
I would just say that post-Paris, I think there'll be a big question and people will really be putting their hands up in the air to figure out what is next in terms of climate change action, and that's really moving toward the solutions. The INDCs provide, while not the entire commitment that we need to reduce emissions as dramatically as we need, they provide the certainty to countries to make investments that Tan is talking about and to really get going on some of these renewable energy and the solutions that we need. And so that will be the pivot that we need to see toward the solutions, whether it be engaging people on the ground or engaging governments at large.
Yeah, and I just put in a plug for millennials and say that, not the hopeless washouts that you think we are. Basically, you're going to see a transition which is millennials coming more into the workforce and more into positions of power. And this is like the inevitable thing that happens. So this is the slower as opposed to the quicker thing, but it is going on in the background. And because millennials have taken more action on climate change in the past, who are more likely to believe in climate change in the past, you're just going to see this gradual transition that's happening in the background across every industry that there is, of this becoming normalised. And people starting to go, oh yeah, why don't we have the renewable energy on the roof of this place? Why don't we have this green thing, whatever it is, a hybrid fleet that I expect? So that basically, that swell of all that stuff happening just organically in the background, plus these more frontline things that you're going to be seeing in the media, like Paris, like people coming out with better renewable opportunities, like the political will building, I think that combination of things will start to create the snowball effect that we need.